I'm here.
Okay. Oh, Tim, you still there? Where'd he go?
Yep.
Oh, there he is.
Still here.
Okay. Okay, Tim, we're ready.
Let's go to God in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you very much for this time to come to you this evening, Father, and learn from your word. We thank you for all the blessings, Father. This time be with Mike as he leads our thoughts this evening, Father. Be with him. Also be with the ones that are sick this evening, Father. Be with the ones that can't be on with us at this time, Father, this evening. You're the ones that are having upcoming tests, Father. Be with them. Also look over the ones that have the virus at this time. Be with the doctors and the nurses that are ministering to them. And be thy will when you're in that matter, Father. Be with us as we study from your word this evening. We thank you for this opportunity that we ask it all in your son's holy name. Amen.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, so with no further ado, chapter 5 is a whole lot of fun, and just a lot of interesting images come to mind. And when you think, where some expressions may have originated from, like the handwriting on the wall, or perhaps maybe the inspiration for something out of the Addams Family. Remember Thing? Remember the hand in the Addams Family? Different things like that. But anyway, I don't know if this was the inspiration from, but I tell you what, if I'm sitting in a room and a hand starts writing on the wall, and that's all there is, it's going to give me the EBGBs too. That's for sure. And it's interesting that how they describe Belshazzar when he sees that, how his knees start knocking together out of fear. Usually that's something out of Scooby-Doo, and so everybody's scared of the ghost. And but literally, I mean, this is what the Bible said: his knees were knocking together. So, I guess there's something to that in fear. So maybe we picked up a number of things from this chapter that we don't even know about. We can't guarantee that, but there's some interesting human responses and reactions in here. Now, Belshazzar, let's talk about him first of all. Okay, he's a central character in chapter 5. In fact, that's the only chapter he's a central character in the book. Belshazzar was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, why does it say that he was Nebuchadnezzar's son, or why does the queen refer to Nebuchadnezzar as his father? Well, that was a common way in the Bible of referring to anyone who was an ancestor, just as David was referred to as the father of many other Israelite kings. In fact, the ones that did good, they did after their father David. Well, David, his only son Solomon, but except for Absalom for that, when he served him for a while. But the thing is that your father could be used as someone who has dead, and so. That was not, Father Abraham of the Jews. Abraham was the father of the Jewish race. Who was the father of, who was the only Jew, actually, true Jew, he was the father of Isaac. He's the father of the Jewish race. That term father, you say, well, this inaccuracy, Belshazzar, that wasn't his dad. Well, it was his ancestor, and the way terminology was used, it fit quite well with that. Now, the father of Belshazzar was a different ruler of Babylon. His name was Nabonidus. The son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, he was married to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, Nitocris. And, when we get, and I'm just setting the background, if you recall, at a certain part of this narrative, when the queen comes in and addresses Belshazzar, and she's the one that suggests that he call in Daniel, she refers to his father Nebuchadnezzar. And you notice she wasn't there when all the festivities, the drunken festivities were going on with his wives and his concubines. So that suggests something. Why wasn't she there if she was his wife? It wasn't. It was his mom, most likely, not his wife, because his mom, I mean, when he was doing the things he was doing, obviously, with that drunken feast, and his wife and his concubines were there as well, doing whatever they did. His mom probably wouldn't be around to witness that. So anyway, just there are those who say, well, skeptical, well, who said Belshazzar wasn't the king of Babylon? Nabonidus was. Well, why wasn't Nabonidus there? Well, Nabonidus was off fighting at the time. In fact, Nabonidus was off fighting for quite some time, so he left his son Belshazzar in charge of his kingdom. Now, I have in front of me, you don't have this, I'm sorry, I'll try to post this before next time, but I have some ancient inscriptions that were found in Ur of the Chaldees, the Chaldean Empire there. And this was actually one from Nabonidus himself. And I'm going to quote this as I found it. It says, "May it be that I, Nabonidus, king of Babylon, never fail you, and may my firstborn, Belshazzar, worship you with his heart." He was dedicating his son to his own foreign god, okay, at that point in time. So Belshazzar, being the firstborn of Nabonidus, would have been the one next in line for the throne. So that's why he was in power when he was. And once again, don't get confused with Daniel's Chaldean name, which was Belteshazzar, as opposed to Belshazzar. That's something else I think people get confused. Okay, I'm sure we don't, but there are those that would, get things mixed up and try to use that as an excuse to say, well, this isn't true. This is all a bunch of myth. Well, it's not. Okay, so another inscription, the one I just read you was from the 7th year of the reign of Nabonidus. It says, "In regards to the bright star which has appeared, I will undertake to interpret its meaning for the glory of my lord Nabonidus, Babylon's king, and also for the crown prince," who's next in line, "Belshazzar." That was something else, an inscription that we see where Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus. And here's the one that I find most interesting of all. It says, "Putting the camp under the rule of his oldest son, the firstborn, the army of the empire he placed under his command. His hands were now free. He entrusted the authority of the royal throne to him." Whose hands were free? Nabonidus allowed Belshazzar to rule in his kingdom. Why? Because Nabonidus was off fighting in a war for several years. And that's why he wasn't around when all this was going on. And this is also going to explain something else later. And I'm going to leave that up in the air for the moment. But when we get to that, you guys will probably just jump all over it. Okay. So at any rate, those are some of the background historical things that might come up. And then there are some other things we'll talk about later as we get through the story. So if we go back now to the beginning of chapter 5, we see Belshazzar is basically throwing a drunken feast for his nobles. And not only is he throwing a drunken feast, his wives and his concubines are there. So you can imagine the things that are going on. And he orders that the sacred articles that were in the temple of Marduk, not Marmaduke. That's wrong. That's another animal, right? Marmaduke, wrong. Marduk, that Nebuchadnezzar had confiscated when he carried off the inhabitants into captivity. He orders that these vessels be brought in, and what do? They drink out of the sacred vessels that have been taken from Solomon's temple, the gold and silver vessels. And what do they toast? They toast the gods of wood and stone and everything else. So they are desecrating these sacred items from Solomon's temple, these items that were dedicated for the one true God. They're desecrating them by toasting false gods, pagan gods, basically. And this is probably the case. I can't say it with 100% certainty, but in pagan times, when they had the kind of drunken feast, there was almost always sexual immorality also involved. And that's why among ancient people, and when you talk about idol worship, you think, how stupid. You make something out of wood and you buy your own God, and your own God comes with his own rules. So it gives you an excuse to practice things you would normally not. It gives you an excuse to practice sexual immorality in the name of that false God, even though it's a piece of wood. And more often than not, that piece of wood never spoke to anybody and told them not to, right? So this was very common. So when they're toasting the gods of wood and stone and everything else, all these other pagan gods, what usually went hand in hand with that was sexual immorality. And you can guess that. And you can kind of guess that when he talks about all those wives and his concubines being there, there's a good chance that, well, what was going on. So all this being said, okay, as we move along here, in the midst of this drunken feast, something very astonishing occurs. right out of nowhere, a hand appears and it writes a message on the wall. And Belshazzar's response to this message on the wall is almost comical, because it scares the bejabbers out of him based on his reaction. Okay, so as we look at in chapter 5, as we look at verse 2, while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father, there goes his father, his ancestor, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. And then they brought him in, it says in verse 3, those which came from Jerusalem, and they all drank out of him, and the concubines. And verse 4 says they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron and wood and stone. And then, so this party was reaching its peak apparently when the handwriting was on the wall. And when they did that, fingers of a man's hand, verse 5 says, appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Okay, now, anything that men wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. Any reason in particular why we're given that description, do you suppose? Nobody supposes?
I think that, if something's near a lampstand, it's meant for someone to see it. We're not writing in the dark. Where everybody has visual aid of it, it would draw the attention to it like a spotlight. So I don't think this is by accident that it's written in that way. And it may have been in an area that everybody could see too. I don't think it was meant for just a few eyes to see. This was something that was not only going to scare him, but everybody that was there. It's going to take notice. They're trying to, God's getting somebody's attention. It's most likely everybody's attention and everything. So he doesn't do it subtly, does he? And that's a good thing, in that. So that was my take on it, Mike.
Okay. And, I think you're right on the money, because that, I don't know about you guys, that would have spooked me. I'm sorry. It just appears and writes on just a hand. And so, oh, what's my hand? Oh, look here. Oh, you can't read it. Okay, this was when Dominic was a kid, when I made these hands to illustrate. You probably can't see that very well. All right, but anyway, a hand just appears, writes on the wall like that, right? Oh, that was better effect, I suppose, right? Karen told me to do that. But that would be spooky. And it must have been, because eventually it said Belshazzar's hip joints were loosened and his knees started knocking together. Have you ever been so scared where you were like shaking? Where you couldn't say anything, were you in fear? Well, I don't know exactly what state of fear he was in, but when your knees are knocking together and you're not just doing that, this happened because there's some going on there. So, maybe sometimes, when you get angry, you can feel yourself trembling if you're really angry, or maybe sometimes even when you're a little bit nervous about something, you do that. But I don't think I've ever had my knees knocked together. And I used to get spooked easy when I was a kid, especially with one of my uncles filling me up with ghost stories all the time and vampire stories. So which is another story in itself. But I can relate to this being spooked thing. And this was more spooked than I think I've ever been. And I used to get spooked quite a bit when I was younger. Because there's a lot more superstition when you grow up Catholic, I guess. But anyway, this was something that really shook the palace, if you will. All right, now he immediately, basically it said his countenance changed and his thoughts troubled him. Well, you can imagine, and if his knees are knocking together, obviously there was some fear going on. But then in verse 7, he cried aloud, he said, to bring in the astrologers. So first one he calls for all these magicians and astrologers. Okay, what do we get from this about Belshazzar, or just in general? First people he calls for. What's this telling us about him?
same ones as his grandfather called for first.
Okay. Is there a history lesson in this somewhere? Just
You
this
don't
part
learn
right
from
here.
history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, and I think he was probably going to repeat it even worse than old granddad did at this point in time. And later on, Daniel's going to pretty much tell him so. So he calls in for the supposed wise men, and they do their usual thing, which is fail and show that they're frauds once again. And what is it that he's going to offer to them? I mean, he's really serious. He wants to know what's with this handwriting on the wall. So what's his offer that he makes if they can get it, if they can tell him what this means?
Third ruler in the kingdom.
Yeah, the third ruler in the kingdom. And they'd be clothed with royal purple, and he put a chain around their neck, basically. That's not chain of gold around their neck, chain around their neck. That sounds like he made him a slave or something. But so here's one thing I want to ask: why the third ruler of Babylon? Why third?
Because he was the second in command himself, because his dad was away as the king fighting.
So he's actually only number 2 on the list. His dad's 1, he's 2, so he's not going to give away his position. So that's what was next available. Position number 3. So the third ruler of Babylon, and I think that's a very good explanation of that, because somebody, well, why the third ruler of Babylon? Nebuchadnezzar promoted Daniel to be the second most important man in all of Babylon. Well, why is he only offering the third thing? Who's the number 2 guy? Well, Belshazzar's the number 2 guy, because his daddy's number 1 at that point in time. So he's not going to get his position. So none of them, obviously, we know they can't make heads or tails of it. And so once again, the wise men, the alleged wise men of Babylon, don't come through in the clutch. But someone else has a better idea, and this is when the queen comes on the scene. Now, the queen, this is most likely, I'm pretty certain, it's Nitocris, who is the wife of Nabonidus. She was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And so Nabonidus was actually Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, but Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's blood. He was his grandson. And so when she addresses the king, and notice one of the things, once again, that clues us into this wasn't his wife or one of his wives, because of the way she talks to him and the way it says the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. Everybody else was already there that was partying with him. Why wasn't she already there? If she was one of, when he demanded all of his wives and his concubines be there, but that was his mom. So yeah, mom, you didn't want mom around when you were partying. So that's the explanation for that. And I love how all of this fits together, in a very consistent narrative of what went on, a very accurate and consistent narrative. And so she tells him, hey, look, there was in the time of your father, Nebuchadnezzar, actually her father, his grandfather, there was this guy named Daniel who he called Belteshazzar among the Hebrews, and this guy was wise. I'm telling you, he had wisdom of the gods and like that, and he's the one you need to bring in, basically. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, here. It says here in verse 11, it says, and in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. And inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. So she says, there's somebody who can do this. He did it for your dad, your grandpa. He can do it for you too. That's who you need to turn to, not these other guys. And so he calls for Daniel. And he makes his offer to Daniel of all these things. I'm going to put a gold chain around your neck. You're going to wear purple, and you'll be the third ruler of Babylon. So he's got all these gifts. Just tell me what this means. And what's Daniel's response here about all these gifts and making the interpretation? How's he respond? I think his response is quite impressive. What is impressive about it in your mind?
I think that because if another man had been in that position where he'd been offered what this, Belshazzar was offering Daniel, they would say, oh yeah, thank you. But Daniel turns him down. May it come back to you. I'm not interested in receiving a reward for this. And that shows you the humility of him. And in this case too, we don't see, like last week, we talked about the compassion that Daniel had toward Nebuchadnezzar. When he understood what Nebuchadnezzar's dream was, he felt bad about it and everything, but he doesn't feel bad for Belshazzar. He's
No.
gonna lay it on the line and tell him like it is, and that. So you see that a little bit here too, where there was definitely more of a friendship with Nebuchadnezzar that there isn't with Belshazzar, and that. So, and perhaps he also knew that even though he were to give him this, it would be short-lived. So
That's true too. But yeah, and I mean, in this case, Daniel is almost like Jonah. What Jonah would want to have told the Assyrians at that point. It's like, you're going down. But anyway, I think that's interesting that he does turn down the gifts. Now, Daniel's advanced in years. The year of this is 539 BC. Remember, Daniel's been in captivity since about 605. He came in as probably a teenager. And now we're talking near about 66 years later. And Nebuchadnezzar has been dead for over 2 decades by this time. And Daniel's advanced in years. He's a senior citizen. What's that? Yeah, he might. Yeah, let's see. 61 plus a T. He's pushing 80 at this point in time. So it's not like he's a young fella anymore. Okay, sorry, Dad. Okay. But anyway, almost picture. I mean, Daniel seems to have all this sense throughout his life. But a younger Daniel may have left out the other part about just keep your gifts. I don't know. But an older, wiser Daniel. And hopefully, as we all get older, we get wiser. I hope one day I do too. But anyway, an older, wiser Daniel was not at all interested in these gifts. But he's still gonna interpret what was going on for him because God gave him that gift. And it's not a very pleasant interpretation, as we know. When he gives the interpretation, he really calls Belshazzar on the carpet. I think this is really because when he gave interpretations for Nebuchadnezzar, especially the time just last chapter when he said, basically you're going to eat grass like an oxen and this kind of thing, he hated the fact that almost he had to tell Nebuchadnezzar that. He felt bad. But this time he lays it out there. It's like, you have this coming. He's like, and what's interesting is it's almost like Daniel's teaching a history lesson as well here as we move on. Now, when he comes before the king, the king, of course, makes his offer and he says, I've heard of you and what you can do. And here, and of course, Daniel turns all of that down very often. Give your words to another, yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. Now, before he gives the interpretation, he's giving some reasoning behind it. It's not like, well, this is the interpretation, deal with it. He actually is explaining, I think, which is also good for us. He's explaining why this is going to come about. And so he gives him a history lesson about Nebuchadnezzar. He says in verse 18, O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of the heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. So here's the history lesson. Your granddaddy, he went down because he got too high on himself, right? Now, all right, so Belshazzar, at this point, he was probably, yeah, that's what happened. Yeah, that's what happened. Now Daniel's going to lay it on Belshazzar. But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all of this. In other words, you don't have any excuse. You knew what happened to your granddad. You knew what God did to him. You knew what happened when he got too high on himself. He said, and you have lifted yourself, his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. So in other words, you gave glory to all these phony gods, these of yours, but you didn't give glory to the one true God who holds your breath in his hand. So at this point, what are you thinking if you're Belshazzar? You think good news is coming after that? Setting him up, and he's letting him know why. I mean, he is reading him the riot act. And of course, we know Daniel's inspired by God because why he knows all these things and can interpret this. So here we go. Now what's the writing mean? Here it is. He says, then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, that is God, and this writing written, and this is the inscription that was written. Now, this is the first time we know it was, in our account here, that it's mentioned specifically what was written on the wall. The words mene, tekel, upharsin. And he's going to interpret this. Mene, and that was written twice, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. So, in other words, the end is coming. He said, tekel, you have been weighed in the balances. So, you're being judged. You're weighed in the balances and found wanting. You failed the test. Okay. Perez, and that's a takeoff from the next word, upharsin. In fact, that Perez is interesting because if it also is similar to the word Persian, which is going to play a role here historically. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. In other words, you're done. That's what this means. Now, this is not a good interpretation, and Daniel doesn't try to sugarcoat it, and he doesn't say, oh, I hope this doesn't happen to you, king, like he did with Nebuchadnezzar, which, as Dee mentioned, you can see there was a better relationship between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, obviously. He did not have the same regard for Belshazzar, and maybe we can probably see why he didn't. Didn't it seem like at times there was hope for Nebuchadnezzar? I mean, didn't you think, in spite of all that anger that he could, in that personality, almost bipolar, didn't you see, like, what? He could be a Christian, or well, in that day, he could actually be a child of God. He could turn. We don't know that he ever did. There's a chance that he didn't. But with Belshazzar, I'm thinking his chances weren't very good based on what's going to happen next. I'm thinking Belshazzar probably didn't end up in a very good place afterwards. But in spite of that, what's the one thing we need to give Belshazzar credit for after he hears this prophecy of gloom and doom? Why should we have at least, what's the one thing Belshazzar does?
He didn't kill Daniel.
What's that?
I say he did not kill Daniel.
He didn't kill the messenger, okay? But there's something else in addition to that. Was he true to his word about what he was going to give him? In spite of the fact Daniel didn't even want it? Mm-hmm. He at least kept his promise, so at least, he did something, that was noble. It kind of reminds me, I'm getting off the topic a little bit here, but during the 1600s, there was a king of England named Charles I, and he was the king of England from 1625 to 1649. He was one of the worst kings in English history, and almost everything he did as a king was terrible. He was dishonest. He raised taxes to an extreme amount. He got the country involved in wars that were very expensive. He was constantly at odds with Parliament. He ran roughshod over the rights of the people. But there was one thing he did well. You see, in 1649, his own people put him on trial, and they found him guilty of treason, and they executed him. And the only thing that historians say he ever did well was when he went to his death, he died like a king. He went to the chopping block, never whimpered, never whined, and he even gave the signal to the executioner when to wield the axe that was going to cut off his head. Okay, so that's the only kingly thing he ever did in his entire life. So maybe Belshazzar, the one noble thing he did, as far as we're concerned, is he kept his word and he gave Daniel what was promised, in spite of the fact that it wasn't a very friendly prophecy toward him. So anyway, this is going to be the end, and then it goes on. And, you know, after he rewarded Daniel and made him the third ruler in the kingdom, for what that was worth when the kingdom was going down. That very night, Belshazzar was slain, and that's when he not only was he slain, but Darius the Mede took over in Babylon. And this is interesting. So that very night he was slain. So it wasn't like he had a week to think about it. It was pretty sudden. It was over. And there is historical evidence that backs this up as well. And I have some things I can read to you. And let's see. Okay, this was from the writings of Cyrus the Persian. I'm guessing it's from Cyrus the Great. This was written about the conquest of Babylon. And of course, Babylon was the city that would have been taken over at this point. And this is a quote. It said, "A coward was put in charge as the king of this country. With evil intents, he did away with the regular offerings to the gods and desecrated the worship of the king of his gods, Marduk." Now, thinking, wait a minute, what's Marduk got to do with any of this? Well, here, that's the impression that he gave. Think about, maybe that was the impression he gave to Cyrus, perhaps, that he was disrespecting his own god that he worshiped, Marduk. In fact, he was actually disrespecting the one God, but that could have been misconstrued. But I want to note that whenever Persia, which would come into play here, the Medes and the Persians would come in and take over. Whenever Persia overran an area in ancient times, they almost always allowed that group to keep their own traditions and customs. They were very tolerant. In fact, oftentimes they picked up on the customs and they adapted for themselves. They adopted the customs of the people they conquered from time to time. That's a very interesting thing about the Persians. And they were a very tolerant empire. And that's one of the reasons why they were the largest empire in the world for about 200 years. But anyway, that was the take on the ruler of Babylon. The king of Persia referred to him as a coward. Now, it was believed that these Medes and Persians were able to easily invade Babylon at that time because the river bed had dried up and it allowed them easy access into the city. It was almost like a total surprise that they got there. Now, I don't know if even if it wasn't a surprise, if it would have mattered as far as in the long run taking over. But it made it a lot easier. And, you know, here's the prophecy. And that very night, Belshazzar is slain. So the army came in and they had no mercy. And now Babylon, and this would have been 539 BC, is taken over by the Medes and Persians. And it mentions here in verse 31, Darius the Mede. Okay, now Darius the Mede is not mentioned anywhere else historically. So is this a fictional story? Did somebody make up this name for somebody and just, well, there is someone else in history whose name was Gubaru. Okay, Gubaru was a Mede. So, and of course the Medes were among those who were conquered by the Persians. Gubaru was born, and this is fascinating. Gubaru, we have record of when he was born. And he would have been like a chieftain, that kind of thing, under Cyrus, the king of Persia, Cyrus the First, aka Cyrus the Great, because he had conquests. So, side note: whenever in ancient times you were a conqueror, you got the nickname the Great. You really had to earn that title in ancient times, the Great. And the ones that had that title, they were military conquerors. But anyway, Cyrus would have been over this Gubaru. He would have been working for him. Now, Gubaru? We have record of when he was born. He was a Mede. He was born, let's do the math, in 601 BC. The conquest of Babylon was 539 BC. You do the math. How many years is that? Okay, I'll do the math. Okay.
61 or
601
62.
minus 539, that gives you 62. Being about 62 years old. I'm about 55 right now. Next month I'll be officially 55. Okay. So if you said right now I was about 55, you'd be correct, right? I mean, that's, yeah. So it says here about Gubaru being about 62, and that fits right in. So as Nelson said, he's either 61 or 62. He was about 62. That seems to be the most obvious answer to who Darius the Mede was. Now, the term Darius means one who holds. Darius the Mede, that's even more descriptive. You know, it tells you his nationality, and he was a ruler, a Mede and a ruler, one who holds the scepter. It might very well have been a title, not a name. His name was Gubaru. I'm convinced that this is who that was. There will be future rulers of Persia named Darius. There will be a Darius the First that's very significant for some of our discussion, also a Darius the Third later on that will be very significant in our discussion as these prophecies of Daniel will later be fulfilled. But this I find this fascinating. Just it can't all be coincidence. You know what it is? It's all truth because it all fits together like a puzzle, almost perfectly and seamlessly. All right, so Josephus wrote that Darius the Mede, along with his relative Cyrus, brought an end to the Babylonian Empire. That's from the writings of Josephus, the Jewish historian during Roman times. So anyway, all of this fits together quite well. Okay. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
I do.
I've been doing most of the talking. I apologize.
Yeah,
Go
Mike,
ahead.
I have, I don't know if it's a question, but you know, when the Queen Mother is talking to Belshazzar and the crowd about Daniel and his abilities and everything, I get the sense that Daniel has kind of been out of the picture, or he's not in the hierarchy of things at this point in time. Do you get that idea too?
Absolutely. And because just the way she describes him and the fact that she had to tell Belshazzar about him. I mean, so Belshazzar is in his own world. He's got his own people around him, even though his dad was the actual official king. And remember also, I don't know if any of you have that that outline I put out. I think I put out the rulers of Babylon on there. I don't know if you could share that, Matt, if you would, part of my outline with it has the rulers of Babylon while I'm talking here. It doesn't, if not, that's no big deal. But as far as the line of succession, there were others in between Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus. Nabonidus took the throne by force. And so he, being the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, was basically, in a sense, restoring the royal line since he was married to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. So there were others in between he and Nebuchadnezzar that had ruled. And then when you talk about the fact that when this takes place, okay, Nebuchadnezzar had been dead. He died in 562. This is 539. So we're talking 23 years-ish that Nebuchadnezzar wasn't around. That's over 2 decades. We don't even know how old Belshazzar was. Maybe Belshazzar, well, I don't want to say that because I think he knew. I think he must have known his grandfather at some point in time, perhaps. But the thing is it possible that Belshazzar was even too young to remember and only knows what his mom told him about Nebuchadnezzar? Because think about it, you know, I have students now that weren't alive when I started teaching. All my students now, they weren't alive when I started teaching. I had some of their parents in class, high school, a lot of them. So if I went to another school, they wouldn't know who I was. And if I came back all of a sudden, oh yeah, hey, there's Mr. Vargo again. Who? So I think there could be an element of that involved. Okay, so there we go. Let's see, can we scroll up there until we get to the rulers of Babylon, maybe? There we go, perfect, okay. So we see Nebuchadnezzar, he was in power, and you know, this is a nice chunk of time we're talking about 43 years roughly in power. And remember, Daniel would have been with him probably that entire time virtually. And then he's succeeded by a son of his, evil Merodach. Notice he doesn't last very long. And then there's a Neri-Glissar, who also doesn't last very long, who is a son-in-law. So the son-in-law murders the son. So Neri-Glissar murders Merodach. So we've got issues, for the succession to the throne. And then the last person here, this Labashi Marduk, was actually practically an infant when his dad, Neri-Glissar, left the throne to him. That's when Nabonidus comes back, and basically, I think he does away with everybody there. I think there's a good chance that he actually even killed this young Labashi Marduk. So he takes over in 555. So Nebuchadnezzar's been dead roughly 7 years at that point. We don't know how old Belshazzar was. I get the feeling Belshazzar was pretty young and reckless and stupid based on some of the things he did. So he probably knew of Nebuchadnezzar. Whether he was alive, I doubt he was alive when Nebuchadnezzar was humbled and made to be like a beast. He wasn't alive for that. But I'm sure through his family, he knew about it. I know a lot about my grandparents based on what my parents told me, because I didn't know all of my grandparents and so forth. So as far as Daniel seems to have faded out of the picture. And my guess is when Nebuchadnezzar was done in power, that Daniel slowly, if not almost immediately, wasn't involved with the government anymore. And it was like he was in the background. And now the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, who would have been very familiar with Daniel, she recalls this and lets her son know, hey, this is the guy you got to talk to. So getting back to your point, Brenda, I think you're absolutely correct in what you said there. That's my opinion for what it's worth. Yeah, it's been a long time. So, okay. But thanks for that, Matt. Okay, that's the outline I wanted. Perfect. So, okay, other questions or comments?
One interesting point that I hadn't put together at all, and I don't know what significance it might have until this reading of it, but when it actually explicitly points out that, as you highlighted, that the handwriting on the wall appeared opposite the lampstand. You also, what struck out to me, or stood out to me, is that he's desecrating the articles of the temple, and in the prescribed mapping of the temple, opposite the lampstand in the temple would have been the showbread or the bread of the presence. So I don't know what, it's just kind of an interesting connection that came to mind for me, that where the bread of the presence would have been in a temple-like setup with the articles of the temple is where the hand shows up.
And that's a great point, Logan. I didn't even think of that. That's an excellent observation, I think, based on, how the temple was set up and so forth. And I think, that might be something that's easily overlooked, but I think you pinpointed something there. Good observation, really was.
Something else, Mike, that I found was interesting with the words that were written, that in Aramaic, they relate to weights. And that if in Aramaic, if you were to read it out, it would have said numbered, weighed, and divided. Mm-hmm. And that the words would have meant that, which maybe these people that he called in initially that were like magicians or something like that, if they were learned men, maybe they understood what the words might have meant or what it was referring to, but maybe not how it related to Belshazzar, kind of thing. Whereas Daniel comes in and God has revealed to him exactly why he chose those words and what they did mean to Belshazzar's life. So he was numbered, he was, weighed and divided and that. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. It wasn't like he spoke or it was written in some unusual tongue that only a few, nobody knew or something like that. It was words that maybe some people could have figured out, but had no idea what the meaning really was. So I thought that was kind of
almost like a parable to an extent. People, they understood the words, but how do they apply? What do they mean? Well, Daniel gave the application, that's for certain. And once again, not to pound a dead horse, but he also once again proved the inadequacy, to say the least, of these wise men of Babylon, and the fact that they were frauds. And who knows how many of them survived the attack? Obviously, Daniel did, because we hear about him in the next chapter, right? The next episode. But the next chapter also references Darius the Mede. And what's interesting is Darius the Mede seems to have a good relationship with Daniel also. So Daniel is promoted right about the time, well, the exact time is when the king's going down, but Daniel's not. So God was keeping Daniel around for a little while. God wasn't finished with him yet. He had more things to interpret and prophesy about. And what's interesting, he went from being a key part of one powerful empire to being a key part of another powerful empire. That's a very difficult thing to do, to transition. If you're among, he goes from being a captive, carried off into captivity from his homeland, to being the second most powerful man in Babylon. Then, after almost the time of retirement, you can almost call it, he makes a comeback, and once again is among the most prominent men in Babylon, but now under a different empire, a whole different set of rulers. Now, I think that speaks very highly of Daniel, how the kind of man he was, that was respected, it seems like, by different cultures. But of course, we also know that was because of God putting him in that position. So, that's something gives glory to God, but also I think we can give Daniel some props, because God doesn't put him in that position unless God's impressed with him also. So, there's a combination of things going on there. But why? What do you think what was, and we've talked about this before, but let me ask this again. What do you think was one of the major reasons why God was so big on Daniel?
I've always got the impression that Daniel's heart was right.
Maybe this statement, Mike, should be, why was Daniel so big on God? Maybe that's what you should be saying, because that's exactly where that came from. It wasn't so much that God looked down and said, oh, look, here's Daniel. He's kind of a nice guy. Daniel was very big on God, and God used people that stepped up and showed that they were committed to him, and that's where it came into, and of course the humility that came with Daniel always. So Daniel was very big on God. So that's really your answer, I think.
Yeah, that's not the only possible answer, but the humility was the one I was really looking for, because he was humble. I mean, could you imagine if God would have put somebody like Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel's spot, or even Belshazzar, or Judas Iscariot? I mean, what they would have done in that position. But he knew his heart, and Daniel was a humble man, and Daniel was a godly man, and it served him well, and that glorified God as well. So put him in that position.
I was going to say that Daniel didn't have an easy life, but he never once, his faith never seemed to waver. He never, overlooked how challenging the circumstances of Daniel's life were, because he doesn't make a big deal about it. He doesn't, and yet he had a very challenging life, and a lot of hard things came to him in his many years, and we never read of his faith wavering at all. So the other thing that stands out to me that I think is interesting, but maybe even almost a little bit sad, is all these thousands of years later, everybody still knows the expression, the handwriting's on the wall, and people use that all the time, worldly people. And how many of them don't even know where it came from? To me, this is the origin of that expression, the handwriting's on the wall. And I remember when Mike got his master's degree education, it was funny. It was actually in a program in Bible literacy. It was a master's of education, but in Bible literacy, tied to his history. And they talked about how in a lot of literature, the Bible plays such a role, but people don't even know it. Like in a lot of common everyday literature, there's a lot of biblical parables, allegories, examples, little bits and pieces of things. And even common in our sayings, like this one, we use that saying to this day, and think of all the people in the world that know those words and have no idea what it really refers back to. I think that's kind of sad, but it's also kind of neat that it's endured, that like this saying has endured for centuries and thousands of years. People don't even know the origin of it, but this is such a compelling, amazing story that we all know that expression to this day. We use that expression, the handwriting's on the wall.
Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. get a lot of credit for stuff that's just in the Bible.
Yeah.
Yep, that's for sure. He had a lot of eloquent, most of his eloquent speeches were very much biblical quotes or paraphrases, to say the least. So definitely, he could preach it, no doubt about it. Okay, we are at the end of this chapter, and normally we don't get done this early, but is everything that I would like to cover, I've covered. Now, it's up to you if you want to add anything else or ask any more questions. I don't want to start into chapter 6 until next week. We'll try to keep this chapter by chapter. So, but as a sneak preview, Darius the Mede and Daniel are going to form quite an interesting tandem coming up in the next chapter. And yeah, I think at the end, yeah, well, you know what happens. Oh, okay. Karen's telling me to stop.
Mike.
Yeah.
Mike.
Go ahead.
Yeah, where is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego at this point in time?
You know, we don't know. I mean, remember, they were around Daniel's age. Is it possible that they might have been dead by now? I don't know. They're not mentioned anymore in this book.
Okay, the reason I'm saying this is that I wasn't here when you were discussing about them going into the fiery furnace, about the fact, you know, that they didn't bow down and pray to Nebuchadnezzar's statue. But at that point, they're talking about them. And the reason that they didn't do that, this is what the consequences were to be thrown into that fire. Where was Daniel at that point? He was still young.
Well,
but then wouldn't he have been one that
well, Daniel, well, it's possible. It's possible that Daniel was off on the king's business elsewhere. Remember, he was a very high-ranking official under Nebuchadnezzar. And so it wouldn't have surprised me a bit if he just was out of town. It's not, we don't have a record of what was going on with Daniel when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown in the fiery furnace. I'm likely to just assume, which is dangerous, I know, that he was off on other business, either that or, I don't know. I think that if he would have been around, we would have read something about him, just how he was. I think he would have at least been there to encourage his friends and pray for them at the very least, and maybe even go to bat for them. I could see him doing that. Just my opinion, but my best guess is that based on his position as the second most powerful man in all of Babylon, he was off somewhere else doing business. Because remember, this was a very large empire, and there were other parts to administer to from time to time. So that's just my best guess. I can't tell you that with 100% certainty.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, other questions or comments before we wrap it up?
Hey, Mike.
Yes,
Just for everybody, of course, these are recorded and we post them on YouTube and Facebook for anyone who wants to go back and look at older classes. But from tonight, I had a couple of things I wanted to share. In verse 6, where you talked about how scared they were, some of the translations actually talk about how he soiled himself. So it could be, it talks about the joints of his loins becoming released. So whatever that means. So he was pretty scared.
Okay.
And then also, you mentioned that letter about how he was sacrilege against the false gods there, and so I think back at the beginning of the book, they took those articles from God's temple, but they put them not just in the king's treasure store, but in the temple of their god, Marduk or whatever, right? So to take them out of there and drink and have the party, they were not only transgressing, the honor of the true God, but they were also profaning the temple locally there as well.
That's right. And it would have definitely had that appearance to King Cyrus that, here's their God's temple, Marduk. Obviously, God's temple wasn't in Babylon. But yeah, that's the point, Matt. Here, okay. So the king sees, they got these articles that they took out of their God's temple. And, he didn't know where they came from at the time. So that's a good point. That makes more sense of what was said in his statement about, how they desecrated those articles of Marduk's temple. It's like they weren't Marduk's articles, but they came out of his temple, even though they were articles from Solomon's temple previously.
Mike, I read something about Nabonidus that he did not like the god of Marduk, and that did not make him popular in Babylon. And that may have been one of the reasons he left, because his favorite god was the god of sin, which doesn't mean what we think it means, but it's like the moon god or something like that. But that might have referred to him because he's well known for not liking Marduk, and they did not have a lot of respect for Nabonidus. And even Cyrus coming into that could recognize that the people in Babylon had not had, because that's their favorite god, like, somebody saying that they didn't like Buckeyes here in Ohio or something, and we think, oh, that's sacrilegious, throw them across the line, or something,
Don't get Darren started.
What are you doing? You like Michigan, you've got to move away, or something crazy, but Nabonidus, that was part of the issues he had. Even though he did leave for other things, that was one of the issues he had, was that he did not like the god of Marduk, and they knew that. Other nations knew that, and that was part of his trouble. And when he came back after Belshazzar had died and lost the Babylon, and that when he came back, they easily captured him and everything and took him away. So I just thought that was kind of interesting as one of the reasons he wasn't in Babylon anymore. So
he was off waging war. I think he was at Tima, the place he was when they invaded Babylon. But that's a good point. Because like about half of his reign, by the time he came into power, he was off fighting, and so he was very busy outside. He seemed to be more interested in waging war than being an administrator, to say the least. And there have been other kings in history that have been in that situation too. Richard the Lionhearted comes to mind. You've probably heard of him. So during the Crusades, he was off fighting instead of ruling England, which is part of the legend of Robin Hood, which may or may not be true. So, okay. Well, thank you all again for all of your comments. And if or Don, could I get you to lead a closing prayer for us tonight?
I'll do that. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this time that we can be together and to look into the aspects of Old Testament history. Those things, Father, that we may sometimes just gloss over. We really appreciate the lessons that Mike has brought before us to help clear up a lot of these things. And we just pray, Lord, that we can add these things to our knowledge and also to our faith, Father, in the power that you have and how you will watch over your children and take care of us. We pray, Father, that you be with everyone that's having difficulties in life, especially, Father, those that have been mentioned this evening, and watch over them and provide for them, Father, the things that they need to restore them to a normal portion of health, if it be your will. Watch over us and care for us, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you.